Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this is our second webinar in the series this year. We will have a third webinar. We haven't announced it yet, but look out for that. And we're very pleased in this webinar. I'm just here just to open up the show, but I'll pass over to my colleagues Richard and Mariam in just a minute, and they'll introduce the webinar. But I'm Simon. I'm the coordinator of the Outcome Mapping Learning Community, and we're very pleased to have you all with us today. We don't have time for you to introduce all yourselves, but we do want you just to say who you are in chat, just so you can have just a little introduction and find out who is in the session. So I'm just going to show a quick slide and then you can see what we want you to do. So if you have in chat ready to write your name, the country where you're calling from, and maybe even something about yourself. So what was the last piece of music you listened to? So if you can type your name, the country where you're calling from, and the last piece of music you listened to, and then just write that. You can enter that in chat when you're ready. And we'll see who we've got. Sushila from Nepal, thank you for joining. Good to see you. Rathi from Cambodia, very good to see you. Richard, everybody loves the sunshine. Oh, that's very apt, I guess, on a British day in spring. We have Quentin from Spain. Folktronica music. That sounds intriguing. Natalia from Russia. AI-generated song. Oh, that sounds very intriguing. Hi, Eva from Sweden. Ricky from Indonesia. And Rathi, you're listening to Baby Shark. Yeah, I get that a lot with listening to children's music. Kike from Spain, Rachmaninoff, beautiful. Midori from Sweden, Brooklyn Baby, Lana Del Rey. Paul in Uganda, listening to country. Phil in Sweden, listening to Kika Sprangers, saxophonist. Connie from the Netherlands, listening to. Oh, that was. It's going too fast. Phil was listening to Ty Trevitt, and Connie was listening to Kika Sprangers. Tim from UK listening to Radiohead. And then we've got Nonathorn from Thailand, Miriam from South Africa, and Micah from Belgium listening to salsa. Annika from Manoir. And Kaya listening to your alarm clock because it's 6 a.m. Very good. Nice to have you all with us. Perfect. So I'm going to pass now to my colleagues, Richard and Mariam, who are both stewards of the Outcome Mapping Learning Community.
Thank you, Simon, very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to you all. I'm so excited to be hosting this with Simon and Mariam, and I'm joining you from London, the UK, where I am a consultant in outcome mapping, outcome harvesting, other participatory MEL approaches, and I'm a steward of the outcome mapping learning community, as a role which I really enjoy. So a very quick hello first from the rest of the team delivering this webinar before we move on. So Steff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hey, hello, I'm Steff, calling in from Belgium, and I work for Voices That Count. We are specialized in narrative-based methods, but I also have a long history with outcome mapping, outcome harvesting, and have been a steward for many years. So happy to share some of the experiences later on that we have.
Thank you, Steff. A lot more from you to come shortly. Jeph, over to you. Will you tell us where?
Hi guys, I'm Jeph from New Zealand. Well, I'm calling from New Zealand. I'm also Indian. I'm born in India, and those are both important to me. I'm an independent consultant. I love outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, but I also love realist evaluation, which I'm getting deeply into, and I'm doing a combined one at the moment. And overall, when asked to do this thing, I think actually most important to me, I just use tools in order to be participatory. That's probably my essential thing I do. It'll come out during this. You'll get to know me a bit more.
Thank you, Jeph. Thank you. And lastly, Mariam.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Mariam Smith, and I live in Sweden, also one of the stewards. And I work a lot with outcome mapping and outcome harvesting as a consultant, and really enjoy the approaches and the tools that they allow us to use. So, yeah. Oh, back over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Mariam. A lot more from Mariam later. Jeph and Steff are both friends and colleagues of mine, and I've heard snippets about their practices over the years, and we've talked about things. I've seen them present, but to my knowledge, I haven't seen them present on their particular approaches to highly participatory narrative-based MEL before. So in a way, this is a world first. So I'm really excited for that. And they have, I think, a really fascinating and intriguing and inspiring adaptations of combinations of different methods and tools in their practices. And it's this blending of tools and methods which some people are calling bricolage. And this is a theme, in fact, of a face-to-face learning lab that we're going to have organized at the end of this year, this calendar year, and the date and location to be confirmed shortly. And this webinar today is the first in a series of free webinars on this theme of bricolage, which are going to be kind of hopefully whetting your appetite for that face-to-face event. Or just be interesting places to explore different ideas. So keep an eye on OMLC communication channels for more news on those webinars and the lab itself. So very briefly, let me talk you through the agenda before we actually get in and hear a lot more from Steff and Jeph. So we're going to kick off with a conversation between myself, Steff and Jeph for around half an hour. We encourage you, very much welcome your inputs during using the chat on any thoughts, reflections, comments, questions. Use the chat for that. We'll accumulate those questions and come back to them later though. So after that conversation, we're going to put you in breakout rooms for 15 minutes. So you can have a cozier discussion with a group of people, 3 or 4 people, to share your ideas, your reaction, what resonates with your practice, or what questions you've got for the presenters. And then we'll have around half an hour at the end for you to actually ask those questions and to have reactions from Jeph and Steff, from other participants as well. So that's the flow. We hope you stick with it for the hour and a half that we have together. So I'd like to kick off by inviting Steff indeed to tell us something, whet our appetite about his practice in terms of narrative participatory approaches. Tell us something about the essence of your work, Steff.
Hey, thank you. So I work for Voices That Count, and as the name suggests, we work a lot with narrative-based methods, and I could share a lot about different ones. I would say the most common ones are photo voice sense maker, outcome harvesting, and I will say something more about that later. And the large-scale listening circles, and maybe one I will highlight here, and I can share more if it pops up, but is one approach that we developed or organically sparked off in an outcome mapping program, where we found out that after 1 year of trying to do progress marker review, that actually didn't work so well, and for different reasons. multi-layered program, a lot of different communities involved, a lot of people involved. So we actually tried a lot of things, work with observation notes, and then bring it to meetings and so on. And we found out that it didn't really work off, and it didn't spark off the energy that we wanted. And like Jeph was saying, that participatory character we had there, we didn't really get it. But it was not that the people didn't know what the change was that they were supporting. So we were looking here at a situation where like 30, 40 community facilitators living and working in communities were gathering every quarter and we were thinking progress marker reviews, and we can do it in such a way. But then we actually changed the entire approach to let's just listen to the people. Let's create a space every quarter for at least half a day to organize what we call listening circles, and people would just share to each other. It was a new program. They also didn't physically meet in between, or some did, but not as a group. So just telling the stories of the changes they had seen in the different communities, since they were already used to think along the way of actor-centeredness and outcomes and outcome mapping and changes in practice, we just added that little rule, like if you tell stories, tell them as changes in behavior, changes in practice of the people that in the community that do different things and that you find important. So we take an approach where we have listening circles across these groups and people sharing all the changes. At that stage, not even thinking about did we contribute to it or not. Later that was added. And that really worked very well. And so we did that on a regular basis every quarter for like some years. So, and I refer to it a bit as an outcome journaling approach, a collective outcome journaling on a regular basis, telling the stories of change to each other. And then we refined the method a bit, and we still refine it, and we use it in many different ways, where after people have shared their stories, we discuss together and we think about, okay, what is the core of our program here? What do we actually want to achieve, and how do these stories link to that? And what can we celebrate as the main achievements? And it really helped to create a common understanding of the project, of the program. How do we, what works, what doesn't work, and what are the assumptions behind all the changes we would like to bring about. So that was a side advantage, you could say, on the sharing the stories of change. But then we actually took time as well to take note of them, to record them, to as simple as writing them on little cards. And we still do that in a project in Belgium. Front side, tell your story, on the back in a few words and a few in your own words. How did we actually contribute to this? So basically, you could say this is just outcome harvesting, but it's in a more open way. We don't burden people at that stage with when, where, what, and the whole logic that we usually have to make the outcome formulations. And that it's as simple as that we, in any given context, assigning people that want to be the eyes and the ears in the system and bring them together and on a regular basis and share the stories of change in a bit of a structured listening approach. So it's basically storytelling, story listening in their own words, and that works very well if we could compare it, for instance, to this predefined progress marker review, where you look for the change you want to see, but actually tell stories and people tell what matters to them.
Super, Steff, for giving us an oversight there. So many questions I want to come back to, but first I want to invite Jeph just to paint a picture of one part of his practice. Over to you, Jeph.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks, Steff. And I love your phrase there, Steff, eyes and ears of the system, because that's really what I'm trying to do. When I started evaluating, I love the stuff like mental health in Afghanistan and communities, street kids in Kenya, people living with HIV in Indonesia. Mariam ran a project with Indigenous people in Northeast Cambodia. Those kind of things, really, that's so much of my heart. But when I'm asked to evaluate there, I'm really humbled. What the heck do I really know about this? What do I understand about it? And Steff's phrase, eyes and ears of the system. And then what can I bring? And I can bring some theoretical understanding about evaluation and asking questions and putting data together. But the people who really understand the voice of the system has got to be the people there. So roughly my approach is, it started off with getting people from an NGO and working with whichever change agent, get some people from their staff and train them in outcome harvesting. What is an evaluation possibly? What is an outcome? How do we interview? How do we collect stories? And then say, you guys go out and do it. You know the language, you know what's going on, you do it, and then collect stories, which is obviously going to be a whole lot more stories than I could collect myself. But these little stories from on the ground, I might do these things with the interviews with the government minister and the Minister of Mental Health and those kind of things, perhaps I would do. But the pyramid approach, the bottom line, lots of stories from the ground in the language that people want. And it's kind of evolved from there. As I get more into it, I've now started doing, when I get asked to do an evaluation, say, actually, we don't even know what the questions are. Let's let people there ask the questions. And now, rather than just staff of an NGO, I try to get them to actually have members of the community come in. So that'll be actual street kids who aren't part of the NGO, or women from the community in Afghanistan. And so just really, really, really participatory. And it's an enormous privilege. It's a bit complex, but I love it.
Wow, Jeph, that's fascinating. So let me just start with you, Jeph. Maybe you could just tease out a little bit more about how you see the approach you just described. What does it take from which methods, would you say? What's inspired it in terms of methodologically?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. One of the I think, bottom line, even before methods that inspired it, the kind of principles that inspire it, I think really, really big for me is justice. You have all these people and organizations and agencies organizing the lives of people and giving, and philanthropic donors, etc., giving money for projects. But whose reality is it? Kind of Robert Chambers stuff. That kind of ethical and justice thing is probably the biggest underpinning, but also coming into it is I've done a lot in my early development career. I had another career before development, but in my early development career, PRA, participatory rural assessment in India, with all those people using stones to tell stories and drawing pictures in the ground and all that kind of thing. So that's probably deeply in it. Some of the other stuff that's in it, a long time ago, you may not even remember this, Steff, but Steff was raving to me about SenseMaker. And he used this phrase which just stuck in my head, self-signified micro-narratives. And that SenseMaker is a way of collecting stories from people that they tell you what they mean. And SenseMaker is this really wonderful, sexy tool, but it's actually also quite expensive. And it's great, but it's you can't always afford to use it. So I thought, well, how can we do a SenseMaker that uses, inverted commas, human probes? They can signify the meaning of the stories with someone who actually understands them, possibly even better than the electronic app. So there's that kind of thing in there. And increasingly, as I get into realist evaluation, I see there's a lot of crossover with realist stuff. I think this starts to get to mechanisms in a way that outcome harvesting doesn't do. And we could talk forever about that, but I think there's some realist evaluation twisted into it as well. And then a last thing, which doesn't sound that sexy, but in a way actually is, it's not really a method, it's a tool. But I think IT, like in SenseMaker, but I use Deduce, but using qualitative research software actually allows us to actually meaningfully process a whole lot of narratives collected from a community. So that's somehow twisted in there as well. Where, I think this approach is only possible because IT exists.
Thank you, Jeph. Wow, fascinating. Steff, let me come back to you. And you mentioned certainly there was a connection to outcome mapping, and you mentioned also outcome harvesting. Could you elaborate a little bit on how the practice you described connects to those, and any other kind of methodological or tool inspirations behind your approach?
In this case, but it's not always like that. There is an advantage if you have an outcome mapping framework as a program. Basically, this first project we used it. You could say that we were trying to understand the changes towards the outcome challenge, but we didn't want to use progress markers. We just wanted tell the story of change for that particular actor. That was the starting point. I would say that the method in itself, it's basically the listening circles that we also have in other projects. Actually, as part of almost project implementation, it's not only M&E, but it's also a way of engaging with your partners and community groups. So it's clearly that, and also the principle of story journaling, I would say, on a regular basis with a fixed group of people engaging in storytelling. In this case, we frame it around change, and we frame it around a particular type of change, which we borrow from outcome harvesting, which is changes in the behavior of actors and also spell out the contribution. So it's the flavor of different things, I would say, of the mix. And if you want, maybe most significant change as well, because you talk about the changes that people have perceived in the society or in the community. And it's not only the collection part. So at the end, you have a rich story base. If you do that on a very regular basis, you are literally feeding a database of stories, of real lived experiences of people or how they perceive the world. And if you cleverly work with them and categorize them in a way, and Jeph was referring to SenseMaker or the large-scale listening approach, where you can do self-interpretation of your own stories. That's also what we add as a little layer to these stories. Like before they enter it, we ask a few questions, but that all allows us to aggregate data, and then you enter a digital application where you, as an M&E coordinator or people sitting in communication departments or people that have to work with the data, it's very easy to dig into and understand and see patterns across the different stories and link them to major outcome areas or certain things you would like to highlight. And maybe one thing that is interesting that I don't know if Steve Powell is here, but more and more what we do is using stories as an entry point for causal mapping. If you have a lot of stories, you can really unpack them into causal linkages that you can find within the stories, and then move into understanding the system through the eyes of the people by literally drawing up the system, but only with elements from I think he's there. I see a message. Yeah. That's really fascinating, and I think we are just exploring that field, but I think it has a lot of potential.
Yeah, Steff, thank you. I'll just follow up really. So you know, collecting stories, narrative approaches, it's a very natural way of interacting with people. On the other hand, you contrasted it already a little with outcome harvesting, and it's very particular information you need for an outcome statement in outcome harvesting. The who, what, when, and where, the significance has to be really robustly articulated, and the contribution plausible and quite detailed and specific as well. And my question really, I'd like to ask both of you this in terms of, do you see any differences in the kind of, both in terms of the richness and the credibility of the information you get from the narrative approaches that you use, and contrast with formulating outcome statements? Do you see any trade-offs, or do you see them stronger or weaker in any way in terms of richness and credibility? Steff first, and then I'll come to you, Jeph.
Well, the first reason we used it, and it's often still the case, is that the people that are key informants and are able to tell you the story of change, we don't want to burden them with explaining the full-fledged methods. We just want to hear the change. So that was one of the first things. And then, but it turned out that actually the data is richer because you also get a lot of context data immediately. And it allows, especially when it's in a collective storytelling thing, it's the negotiation, the discussion, the debating about these things in relation to what you want to do as a project. But of course, it's not working in every context. I mean, sometimes you want to have the more rigid formulation that we have in outcome harvesting or the contribution statements according to certain rules and the way we usually do it. but it doesn't. I mean, it can be used in combination, because once you're sitting in a rich database of stories, it's not so difficult. And somebody's asking about AI now these days also to detect and outcomes and formulate. And a very pragmatic way we apply this, or we have applied it, is that we stick to the stories at the source, at the data generation point. But once we go to analysis or more evaluative use, it's the M&E's job person. It's the MELT person or the team that is responsible for it, and they have the tools and the capacity to distill outcomes in the way that we are used to it. And if we are missing here and there some information, there is always a possibility to go back and beef up your data in that way. And especially when you work I'm mostly working in internal monitoring and evaluation processes, not as external evaluator. Life goes on. I mean, you need to collect data, make sense of it, and act upon it as soon as possible. You don't have time to wait for 6 months to analyze and make nice reports and statements and conclusions, because life has gone on and you wanna be adaptive as you are going. So often we bring a package of data to midterm evaluators or external evaluators that is a wealth of data already from within the project, which they can then work on in all the ways they want to do it. So that's a bit how we do it.
Okay, so you nothing lost in a way. You have you see richness, you see more context, you see ways of filling gaps in information as well. Fascinating. Jeph, do you want to react to anything that Steff said, or fill us in a bit on your thinking of what the richness and credibility questions and how they compare?
Totally riff off what you're saying there, Steff, about context. And I would say in the realist evaluation term, mechanism, how people change as well as what they change. That stuff's all embedded in there. For me, the richness is incredibly much more. You get way more stories. Imagine having 20 street youth taking stories rather than just me. Way more stories. They're way richer. They're way more authentic, because a street youth is talking to another street youth. That's two street youth behind me in the picture. Way more authentic, way more data, and kind of an honesty that maybe if you have an external evaluator, you don't quite get it. So a lot more data in there. Yes, as you say, not that lovely, crisp, beautiful outcome statement that you want in outcome harvesting, but it's all in there in the stories. And that's where IT is quite cool, because you can put it all in. And my first approach to it was put all these stories into IT, and then I'd go through coding and trying to put them together. And you can pull the outcome statements are in there. Among the Afghanistan evaluation had 460 stories. The Pakistan one had over 1,000. There's a lot of stories in there that they're in there. But my next approach was in the terms of philosophically distributing power, say, actually, why the heck am I doing this? And so now I teach guys how to use deduce, which is the qualitative research. And so enormously stimulating for me, having high security prisoners sitting on, kind of illegal, but the corrections allowed us to do it, coding on computers online in real time, and we're all in a room together, and what the fuck does this mean? And this kind of stuff going on. It's fantastic. We have a bunch of Afghan men and women sitting together coding stories that are in PDFs and Dari. So the true voice is staying even onto our database, and they're all talking to each other. And just being in the room at the time is fantastic. They love it because they're learning the skills. The richness of the analysis is so much more because it's a group sense making thing going on. It's not just me. And it's, just so I'm totally happy with it being credible data. There's much more of it, and it's analyzed in a much more authentic way because it's analyzed by people who actually really understand it, rather than me trying to get it into my language and then say, where's the, who did what, when. They can do that. My job is to teach them the principles of outcome harvesting.
Outcome harvesting, you come back to as well. So definitely stick with you, Jeph, and ask you in terms of, you've touched on it a bit, but kind of the skills and experience that you or anyone trying to catalyze, lead, spark a process like you've described, what do they need? And do you need anything in particular in terms of skills and experience of those you're empowering to go out and listen and capture these stories, or do you think you can make it work with anyone?
I'd like to think I could make it work with anyone. That's the whole principle. Anyone's hand. I don't set rules. I used to, when there was a time when we used to have groups going out in pairs, and someone would have to write, and obviously you need to be able to write. So that's got a filter going on there. And I think everyone in this room will accept it. People at Grassroots and the Global South are actually fantastic at telling and listening to stories, way better than us. We've, in some ways, lost that beautiful art of just listening to stories from each other. So it's not so much anyone can learn it. It's the challenge, I think, is for me to get all that jargon, rich OH language, and explain the principles in simple language, and then they can go out and do it. And that's one of the big challenges. And I think one of the challenges also is just that, just feel the feeling. I'm comfortable here. You get on the level with people. There you are with prisoners with not many teeth and tats all over them, and you're sitting amongst them and you're coding, and the language is pretty rich and flowery, and you've got to be comfortable with that, because they're going to sense it immediately. If you're feeling, oh, these guys aren't quite me, then you're not going to. It's really not going to work.
So it does take a certain type of person to be able to just work with everythody, rather than, people more aligned to their professional background.
Yeah, something like. And I think I've had an extraordinary history that I'm so lucky that I feel comfortable almost anywhere. Just luck for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, Steff, can I come to you, because Jeff's been talking about doing this at scale, and I think you've also got experience of doing it at scale. And do you want to contrast your approach to how Jeph described it, or give us a flavor of collecting stories at scale? What does that mean for you and your practice, and any tips and insights?
Then I think we make the reference to what Jeph already said, the method based on the sense maker philosophy, I would say, which I often refer to as the large scale listening approach. And it is an existing approach, and where you go to people and you listen to people, but really large scale. We're not listening to 40 or 50 people. We try to have the hundreds or even thousands of people, and telling stories around the topic of interest. But then at the same time, they will provide answers to questions that provide you more information about what happened in that particular situation. And it's not a simple categorization question. The story is about, that's not only what we ask, but it's more about the dynamics, the drivers, the feelings, the emotions, what is behind that story, that you cannot read in the words that were told by the people. But for the people themselves still belong to that story. And you want to tap into the hidden dimensions of the stories. So that's an established method. We use that a lot for all kinds of, whether it's context, monitoring, evaluations, and so on. But linking it to the outcome mapping, outcome harvesting type of world that we are often in, or the programs, I think we have used it to, when you are in a situation where you are not looking into outcomes of institutional and societal actors, where we are often sitting and we change the changes in behavior of key actors in the society, but you are actually interested more deeper down into community level, at people's level, and the outcomes of an intervention, and there is a contribution of your efforts and intervention. Well, it becomes very anecdotal if you have 5 people or 10 people or 20 people and working with them. If that's the scope, it can be very useful, but to make more valid statements, you need to go large scale. And then you can combine the sense maker approach, I would say, and change the nature of the questions in such a way that you actually describe the changes in people's life as the result of an intervention. And you let people reflect on that and tell the stories of change for them, followed by a set of additional questions, and also touching the contribution aspect, where you can very easily see, we have done that a lot now, whether the contribution of a program or a project was meaningful for them for the change they describe or not. So it's this using the flavor of outcome harvesting to adapt large-scale listening approach as it's meant to be with SenseMaker. And yeah, there is no limit. We have done it, I think 4,000 voices in Rwanda, a few hundred already is also very good. So it allows you to see the patterns of the outcome stories that people have told and use that also as an entry point into your M&E processes.
Thank you, Jeph. Steff, sorry, the follow-up. Jeph touched on this, I think, but keen to have your perspective too, in terms of, the mail world is full of jargon, right? So, and you're talking about engaging the wider public. Are there challenges? How do you address that, or is the storytelling a way of just bypassing all the jargon? I mean, any reflections on that?
And if you talk about challenges, which are challenges?
Challenges in terms of the fact that our world is full of M&E world is full of jargon, and you're trying to engage the general public.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit what Jeph was saying. Everybody can share stories, and that's also what we found, and how we start using this approach in that specific project. Is it's not that they don't know what's happening or they don't know how to express that, but it's when we come with formats and with questions and questionnaires and progress markers to be filled out and so on, then you could, I think you have to be careful who to burden with this jargon and this approaches and the jargon that comes with those approaches, and especially when you work with very different people in different stages and different communities and levels. And the entry point of the stories is a very natural, organic way of doing that. Yeah. It doesn't mean that there are no challenges in collecting them, and that's another thing. But
okay, let's come back to those in a moment. Yeah, no, thanks for that reflection, Jeph. Turning back to you. And there's a couple of questions there in the chat from Tim and Quentin on the kind of practicalities of collecting these narratives. In a way, which I'd like you to reflect on, but in a way also, the practice of interviewing and then taking a transcript and then writing up a change story or an outcome journal or an outcome statement. That involves listening, capturing the voice of the narrator, and then making sense of what they said afterwards. So how similar or different is your process from an interview?
In some ways, exactly the same. It's an interview. It's telling stories. It's listening to what people say. But I think two really significant difference. One, the absolute key one. Who's listening? Who's actually listening to it? It makes a massive difference if you've got, like right behind me, a young woman who's lived in a slum in Kenya, listening to another young woman who lives in a slum in Kenya. Total different story that's going to come out. And then the other difference is that it's more story based, and you're allowed to. You're not pushing them into our boxes, which is the lovely outcome statement. It's just follow your story, and you validate that. And just Simon, I'll just see Simon's question in there. Just what's the bias considerations and story-based approaches, and how do you manage these? Two things I'd like to say to that. One, firstly, what are the biases in non-story-based approaches to cultures which are totally story-based? Think about that. And I'll give a little pause because I think that's critical. And then the other one is just the idea that, yes, one story is a narrative, but if you've collected 400 stories, that's data. So the biases, sure, one story, and there'll be situational biases and biases about who took the story, etc. But I reckon if you've got even 50 stories, all the big stuff's there in the 50 stories, and you can, the really big evaluation questions that you're talking about, the answers are in those 50 stories.
Yeah, great. Thanks. nearly the end of this part of the program is coming, but I just want to give you each a chance to share any final tips or points to keep in mind if you wanted to follow such, be inspired by what you've heard today. Jeph, starting with you.
Actually, I'm just going to, my final thing I'd like to share is a real story from Afghanistan where we had women and men 2023 taking stories. And your previous question, what's the difference? We taught about outcome harvesting and how you do it and how you interview and what behavior and attitudes and relationships and policies are. We taught all that stuff. And then these guys went out, and one of the things I do is support my team. So I went out to, I couldn't even speak Dari, but just sit there listening to it as they were interviewing and look at the body language. And I thought, this is very cool. And at the end of the interview, two women interviewing another woman, our two team members said, we got a policy. I said, oh yeah, what was it? And they said, they're in a remote rural area of Afghanistan. They said, well, our NGO, it's about mental health, and we got groups together and we did all this stuff, and people talked about mental health and what are your issues, and then these women just told us, after you guys went away, we said, wow, let's sit down and talk about other problems. And they said, nothing to do with the NGO, but they said the biggest problem here is child marriage, and girls as young as 12 and 9 and stuff get given away in marriage, and that's really bad for so many different reasons. And between the whole community, they banned child marriage for a tiny little area of Afghanistan, 500 families or so, something really small. But wow, isn't that amazing? And that story would not possibly have come out unless it was two Afghan women listening to other Afghan women tell that story to make it safe, to make it understandable. So I couldn't possibly end this without saying that's a complete gem for me. Tips.
You've shared quite a lot already, but if you had any more,
it's a little bit scary. It was for me. You're kind of going outside normal lines, but really encourage anyone to do it and talk to other people. Have a community of practice. It's been fantastic for me to know people like Phil and Mariam and Richard and Steff, and being able to just share ideas and know there's other people trying different things. Not exactly the same as me, but it's okay to do this stuff. So yeah, take risks, be confident, and make relationships with other people.
Super, thank you, Jeph. Anything, Steff, you want to kind of echo or add or repeat from what you said earlier?
Maybe related to your last question that about interviews. I have a quote in the chat. I said, if you ask people questions, they will answer your questions. If you ask people to tell a story, they will tell you what matters to them. And I think that's a crucial one. So even if you do interviews, I think if you listen to people, it's a kind of conversation you have with people. But one tip I would do, and for me that was at least a massive eye-opener, is even if you ask for stories, sometimes we tap into people's opinions. We ask people what they think about things. And if you change that slightly to, can you share a story? Can you share an experience that you had that would illustrate what you are just saying? You are digging into another kind of reality. You are capturing lived experiences of people, which is it's much richer in data, but it opens a different kind of conversation than staying at the level of opinions and facts and figures. And that's what we try to do, whether it's photo, voice, mouse, significant change, or sense maker. That's always the essence of what we try to do.
Super, and very powerful about comparing questions and stories and what you're likely to get back. Yeah, great. Now there's a lot of questions in the chat. We're not forgetting those. But to thank Jeph and Steff for this first part of the program, and pass to Mariam to take us into the next part, which is going to be about engaging new participants further. Over to you, Mariam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeph and Steff. Something that I really sense in both of your stories is your deep desire to engage in context and to engage really authentically with people. Yeah, there's some exciting questions coming and people who have some experience as well. I'm putting them on mural, and you're free to go in there when you go into breakout groups. I'll share the screen so you can see what the mural looks like as well. So it's basically 2 spaces that you have there and 2 things to discuss. So the first one is how does what you heard relate to your practice or your own experience? So just taking what you've heard and connecting it to your experience, and by just double clicking anywhere on the blue space, there will be a post-it note popping up, and you just start writing in that one. And the second question is, what questions do you have for the discussants or participants? So I've taken note from chat of those you've already mentioned. Some have already kind of been addressed, but feel free to put any more there, or redefine your questions if you want to go deeper on some of them. So we'll take 15 minutes in your groups, and feel free to write in mural. Just keep your questions for later is fine as well, and you can share them in chat. So, okay, wonderful. I hope you've had some interesting conversations in your groups. I see some post-it notes, sticky notes on experiences, as well as some new questions. I'm wondering if, Tim, are you with us? Would you like to share your question there about how Steff, you were wondering a bit more about the practical aspects there that Steff was using?
Yes, thank you. So I've done a lot of evaluation work that required me to go out into the field, either with a team or alone, and to engage with communities and try to understand their perspectives, to try to get to grips with what changes have been realized or what outcomes have been achieved for those communities or individuals. What was challenging, and I guess it always is just the sheer amounts of data those kinds of engagements create. So, like, for example, I've done focus groups, interviews, and there's just a huge amount of data which needs to be distilled. And fine, we have AI, and there's ways and means of doing it, but the learning circle was something that was particularly interesting to me. But even with how Jeph was talking about, those 400 stories that he collected, it's a huge amount of data, and I'm just wondering how you dealt with that. Because even if it is not something that you want to analyze yourself, but you want to give it to a midterm evaluator, you still need to distill it to make sense of it and clean it. And so, yeah, the learning circle was just particularly interesting to me. So I was just wondering how you go about the practical nature of collecting that data. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there is a big difference between if you have a one-off chance to go and listen, compared to you are in a process where you can, at a regular basis, engage with people. I think that makes a massive difference in terms of trust and in terms of being together in a process. So I work mainly in that situations where you have the chance to regularly see people and engage with them. And indeed, yeah. So it's a bit the architecture that you have to lay out of how to collect, and that comes with a whole set of skills and capacities, I think, and some principles. I would say, staying away from interview style, but more engaging in conversations together is one of the things, and the rest is a lot of logistical stuff you have to organize. But I think the power of doing that collectively, and when I say collectively, I don't mean making stories together, but actually start from people's individual stories, but share and engage with them collectively and make sense of them together. And they're talking about learning. I mean, the power of discussing, debating each other's stories, whether it's about what I did in the first project I explained, it's about how do these stories sit in what we actually want to do as a project. Is this examples? Are these good things? Or is this the right strategy? So you create a common understanding as a group. These were project implementers, not the beneficiaries or target groups or partners, but the implementers. But also further engaging in whether it's in a workshop setting where you give meaning to the stories by unpacking them, by reading them, by pulling out the main content or insights and surprises. To have a reflective, learning-oriented workshop process around that. What we always try to do, because we are engaged in processes, is to also ask the question, so what does that mean? Yeah, so not only stay in the analytical sphere, but also bring it down to, if we go home now, what does that mean for us? What can we take home in terms of our program, in terms of our own community work, and so on. And then I think there are supporting, so there is a facilitating aspect, facilitation skill aspect there as well. And then I think there is a whole aspect of the infrastructure that you put in place, you're going to say AI and things like that, but also as simple as having a very logic structured database where you can, at the end, things are put together and you can filter out, you can easily recreate dashboards almost for all the projects we have, simple, more complicated, to whoever needs to go into the data for whatever purpose is able to do that and actually see overviews, but with access to the raw data. And that's the critical thing. But often you have raw data sitting in boxes somewhere or in another database or Excel, and then you only see the output, but you don't have access to those. So allowing to see the aggregated patterns, but having access to the individual stories if needed. And then these days there are a lot of tools and nice things to help you making sense of it. Leave it to that.
Thank you, Steff. You mentioned a little bit. Oh, Jeph, you're ready to jump onto that one.
Could I just 30 seconds for you, Tim? Great question. 400 stories. You've done an evaluation. How can I deal with that? Yeah, but how about you tip it around and say, I've got 400 stories, 20 experts by experience have collected 400 stories, and now 20 experts by experience are going to analyze them. And you add it as part of the time and we did in Afghanistan. We had 3 days where and I was there to do the technical stuff and how to use the qualitative research software, but also hearing that was so good for me to write the report later on, hearing how they're thinking, how they're analyzing, what they're giving meaning to, people who really understand, experts by experience. And 400 divided by 20 is 20. So they did 20 stories each over 3 days, and that was fine. And all the data was analysed by the time I left the country. Fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, kind of on that note, Steff, you mentioned facilitation skills, and Jeph, you're talking about those experts by experience. Kai has a question. What are some of the key ingredients, like people, processes, policies, that an organization needs to have in order to build narrative approaches into their M&E practices? Maybe Jeph, you can start on that one, or yeah, what do you think?
Great question, Kai. And just because you use 3 Ps, I'm going to put in a 4th one, play. I always play volleyball and play games, and that building the relationship. It's that trust thing, that we all trust each other and we respect each other. Allows us to actually listen to what anyone comes in and says, I heard this being saying. It doesn't matter if that's a new intern or if that's the experienced person, because it's not our stories. We're just collecting, Steff's term, eyes and ears of the system. We're listening to the system, and you don't diss someone just because they've only just started working with the organization. You say, well, your story's as valid if you're good at listening to it. So I think those 2 things, valuing stories and also valuing the people within our organizations who collect them, and saying your role and your voice is actually as valuable as mine as being the director and you're the new intern.
Steff, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe the first thing is value the power of stories as a project, as an organization, as a group, as a team, alongside other data. There is a tendency to the hard data, quant data, and the objective data. Just allowing this to be, that this is also part of the reality. Maybe one of the critiques is to more narrative and qualitative material. Yeah. So at the end, you are sitting there with all those stories. So what do you do with it and how do we use it? So it's to also invest in using it in a clever way and allowing that sense making as a process of making meaning from what derives from the stories. So because that's for me the only thing that can keep the momentum, is that people feel it's not about telling my story, it's also about telling my story or being listened to. But that in itself, I don't think over years, for instance, or a period of time, that will not only do the trick. I think it's also that something is done with the data, with the information, with the stories to feedback, and you see that certain things are adapted, or that it's putting out there in the world in bigger stories, or it's finding its way to other levels, and sharing and using the stories together, and that's for me the key aspect. And it's not happening by itself. Somebody will need to coordinate this. That's also for me. It's always what I say every project or program I guide. It's nice, but you need to keep the momentum, and you need to stick to the rhythms that you have laid out to make it happen. And Jeph is talking about trust, and I think that's a critical one. And it's something you need to build over time, especially when people don't know each other. The openness to share and critique and critically reflect and so on. So it's installing that culture within a project, or whether it's in communities or whether it's more in a organizational setup. I think those things also apply.
Yeah. So interesting. And we have still quite a few really interesting questions here as well. I wonder if we can go to Simon. Simon, you can put on the mic maybe and ask the question, the one that we haven't really responded to yet.
Yeah, so I guess this one follows up what Jeph was saying, and when he quoted that that common phrase that one story is a narrative, but a large number becomes data. And I wondered, like, to what extent are we seeing that view is accepted, especially by those with power, donors, government, scientific elite? Are we still having to convince people that story-based approaches are valid?
Yeah, any insight?
Key question, Simon. And I'd say yes, we are. But I'd also say for all of us in this room, probably, we're in that holy space between we get out into communities and we listen to stories, and we're so lucky, we eat lumps of mutton with Afghanis in the street, and we also can talk to the commissioners at a one-to-one personal level, that they'll listen to us. And I think one of our key roles is to actually broker that thing of making that voice valued for people who work in offices in Sydney and London and stuff, and say we want quant data, and that's the only thing that matters to us, and we're the advocates for the story-based approach. I think that's one thing that we do. And so, roughly quickly, in answer to your question, yes, you do have to convince people, but I think it's not impossible, and it's a large part of my role. And I think that's a space we're in, all of us in this chat. That's one thing we have to do.
And kind of related to that, just the legitimacy of stories. Phil, you've got a question there about framing, and yeah, why don't you ask it yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jeph and Steff, for sharing. My question is, we're trying to get people to think systems perspective, think about different actors. But my experience is when you ask people to tell a story, they tend, especially once you're out in the communities, will tend to err towards telling you stories of individual transformation or individual impact, like sort of on that more personal level. But the challenge is we want to try and get a view of, well, how is the system changing, the small changes that are happening in village leaders, or in the local health system or whatever. But people aren't necessarily tuned into thinking about those kind of changes. So I'm just wondering, how do you approach that? I mean, do you ever try to frame the storytelling question, like, tell me a story about this actor or something? Yeah, how do you approach that?
Yeah. The essence of the very first example that I gave was really about this. So people were not telling their stories. For me, that's a critical question. So the sense maker methodology is very often geared towards my individual lived experience story. While in the case I was explaining, it's this eyes and ears principle. Is we ask people that are part and parcel of a system to actually, and here it was community people, but in any program project that is around system change, it's also a careful selection of who are those eyes and ears. So you look at people that know the system, that know the dynamics, that have the possibility to spot and observe things in their work, in their daily life. But if you then ask them, and then for me, outcome harvesting comes in as a kind of lens of looking at the world. If you ask them to tell the stories of change they see in the system, not about themselves, but the changes of they see in the system through an actor lens, that's even better. Then it fits immediately with outcome harvesting. Then I think you get a rich picture, and especially if you do that on a continuous or let's say periodic basis, you're literally reading the system from within the actors. And it doesn't mean, of course, you don't need to validate things and so on, because there might be some biases here and there, but it's we see that as very powerful. And for me, it's one way of almost applying outcome harvesting, but maybe more in a narrative form. But the principle is still the same. And the good thing is, for me, talking about how is it different, is that through the stories, you also get very important context information. So they would not literally follow the definition of an outcome in outcome harvesting, but still it's valid information that about change in the system that you haven't thought about maybe, or that potentially can become something that you can put towards your sphere of influence and try to see as a possible action or intervention to work on. Or if it's something you don't like, you can also work against it within your project to dampen it. So it's a more open, holistical view, I would say. And within all those stories, you can spot the outcomes if you want in outcome harvesting and distill that further and work with it. But the picture that you get from the content is much richer, I think.
Great questions, Phil. Firstly, yes to every single thing Steff said. Great stuff. And just a couple of little things to add. One is, when I work with community evaluators, always sometime toward the end of the interview, as you're right, people mostly tell their own personal story from their own perspective, which might be relatively small. But to ask those, that idea of significance, but the way you ask it is, and how, do you think that that's the same for your neighbors, or is that same for other people? What hope do you have for your children? Those kind of questions where you just gently push them to think a little bit more widely. And the other thing to do is also, we always at the beginning do a system map, and you say, yes, of course, we're going to listen to a whole lot of grassroots people, but we're also going to make sure we talk to various other significant parts of the system. And then you put these whole lot of people at the grassroots saying, this is what's changed for me in my child's mental health situation. But you've also heard from the local community health centre, and you've heard from the Minister of Health, and then our job is to draw all those micro narratives into a bigger system picture, kind of like putting a mosaic together.
Great. So we've got a question here about one of those challenges of collecting stories from community members. It says, how do you deal with confidentiality if communities are analyzing the stories of people they may know? Even if anonymous, the story may clearly lead to that person.
Yeah, that's a great question, and Connie and I were talking about that in the room, in our breakout room. I don't have a really perfect formal answer for that. That we try to be upfront and transparent. Those say Afghanistan or the harvest, it's entirely encrypted, so that nothing will go outside of the collection team. But if the collection team is from the community, they may well know the stories. They may read a story and they'll know, even if you take the name out, you know exactly whose story that is. And it's that thing of being upfront at the start, saying, what are we doing with these stories and why? And then you listen, and would you be prepared to tell the story that and that people know exactly what's going to happen to the story. It's going to come, we're going to listen to the story, we're using it to make this better. This is who's going to be listened to it, and then it'll be encrypted, and no one outside this group will ever read it. And being upfront about that, and then assume that people are telling you a story that they're prepared for the group to hear, so they know who's going to hear it. And that's, for me, that's kind of the best I think I can do.
But
Thanks.
maybe, one way we are dealing with it is that it's not necessarily at the moment of collection or sharing your stories that you, if it's about more sensitive issues, or you can expect that certain the confidentiality is becoming an issue, is that there is a process of anonymizing the stories in such a way, not just by taking out names, because usually we don't even ask for names, but it's more to bring it to the collective. So you have a bunch of stories, let's say 100, 200 people share their stories. You first somehow analyze its processes and bring it to the general patterns of what we see in the stories. These are the collective stories that are emerged from this package of stories, and bring back the patterns. So you depersonalize it becoming something out there, and then you can even go back to the same people or a group of this 100, 200 people to further analyze and discuss. But you are discussing patterns of what is happening out there in the community, but it's not relying anymore on the individual stories, and that works very, very well. Yeah.
We've got a question from Steve. Steve, are you with us?
Hi.
Hi, can you ask
okay.
your question?
Oh, right. Yes. Hi. The one I put in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, obviously it depends on the context, but sometimes I guess your context is you're specifically writing a report which has to demonstrate impact or something that's got a very specific terms of reference. But I mean, like 400 stories, just like it's multiple novels, right? And there's all kinds of different things going on in there. And to what extent do you have an ambition to, because if you're using something like deduce, then, you can, to an extent, build something more like a model, something which is like three-dimensional rather than one-dimensional, that you could then query in different ways and say, like, what's the kind of language that people would use around this, or how do people think about the prison system, or all kinds of different things that or maybe weren't originally in your terms of reference what you expected to do. But if you've got like a knowledge graph with lots of things connected to other things, then in principle you can query it even maybe, months after the event to ask it questions that you never thought of, right? Is that something that people do?
Absolutely, yes. And that exactly that one, the Afghanistan one, that was 2023. They're still using it, and really feels really great. There's an extraordinary guy. He's an Afghan guy who was their M&E officer, and he learnt up to Deduce, and he navigates it really well. And he keeps probing the database. And now that they're all practiced in getting outcome stories, they've got an outcome-based monitoring system. So the database from the evaluation was the start, and now they're just continuing to add it. And exactly what you say, probing it in different ways and asking different questions from it. It's fantastic.
And you do that directly with deduce rather than, so you're going into deduce with the set of data and asking again, right?
Cool. So we set up a project on deduce. It's on my deduce, but they've all got access to it, and they just they're part of the team with access to that project. and then they pay it's relatively cheap, $15 subscription for a month that they maybe do 2 or 3 times a year when they've got a different question to ask and they probe it in different ways. And he's pretty clever, the guy who does it, and he's fantastic. And it feels really good that, you do this evaluation. I did my report and commissioners were actually very happy with it. But now there's an empowered team that uses Deduce and is keeping on using it. That's wonderful.
So Jeph, you've just done some advertising for Deduce. Steff, if you would promote the tool or, share about some of your go-to tools, what would you say are some of your favorite tools for participation and stories?
One thing, but it's not to be used in communities of so on. But if you're sitting on a lot of material, is the dashboards that we develop to really make sense of the data. And I like what you say here, Steve, about do we necessarily need a report? Often not. It's a living database that you can enter the way you want, for the purpose that you want, whether you're coming in from communication or you're coming in from NME or from program management or higher level management. There is one central space where the data is aggregated and all together, and you can engage with it in that way. Another thing which I think works well in outcome harvesting, if you do it for monitoring for longer term, is let's say after 1 year you have your first outcomes, and you really start to make outcome maps from it, causal maps of the outcomes that you collected, not from what you think you should do, but from the actual outcomes that have been achieved. And it's a living story, and the more outcomes you generate, you add them to the map. So I think I'm looking at causal map here as well as one of the potential things you could use for that, I guess. But sometimes it's as easy as a mural map or any software you want to use for that. But it's engaging with how the world is unfolding as you are progressing in the program. To also think about, especially in more complex programs, that you don't really know what's going to happen in the next 2 years, but you have some dreams of what it should look like. It's this whole principle of starting from what is now and start from there and have some sense of direction of where it can go, rather than to set targets and fill the gap to something that is far off. So it's starting from what is now. And such kind of maps, I think, are really helpful to engage with teams, with whoever should be involved with it.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just seeing the time flying. But if you want to give any more tips, I know Phil also added a tip there in the meeting chat, Steff or Jeph, and I'll hand over to the rest of my team here to wrap up.
Oh, thank you, Mariam. Thank you all for very rich contributions. And we could talk all day, I think, but we scheduled it for an hour and a half, so we'll stick with that for now. So it's a big thank you from me for Steff and Jeph. Firstly, a round of applause. Thank you for giving so much of yourselves today and sharing. And I imagine people may want to follow up, so they can find you through the outcome mapping learning community, of course. So thank you very much to everybody who joined today. I'm going to pass to Simon just to give us a final message before we leave.
Thank you. Thank you to Richard and Mariam for organising and hosting today. And again, thank you for Steff and Jeph for sharing so openly. And to you all for joining and making this a very engaging and lively webinar. I've enjoyed the questions and discussion. So very quickly, there's a few things coming up. We don't have all the details right now, but there's another webinar in our series, the third, which will be on using outcome mapping and outcome harvesting together. That will be in early April. Look out for the date and the registration link very soon. And also, as Richard mentioned at the beginning, later this year, we'll be having a face-to-face event, the first learning lab of its kind for about 10 years for the outcome mapping learning community. So we're very excited about that. Look out again for more information coming. And if you want to suggest any webinars, share your experience, let us know. Get in touch. We'll be very happy to hear from you. But otherwise, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next time.